In this video, we're going to evaluate expressions that contain absolute value symbols within them. Now, before we add absolute values into an expression to evaluate it, we need to talk about what an absolute value actually is. So, the absolute value of an integer, or the absolute value of any number, is its distance from 0 on the number line. So it's its distance from 0, how far it is away from that 0 mark on the number line. Since it is a distance, it can only be positive. So think about distances in your everyday life. You would never say that you traveled negative 80 miles. You would never measure something and say that it was negative 12 inches long. Distances are always positive, and as a result, absolute value is always positive. And then the other thing you need to notice is that it utilizes these vertical straight up and down lines. So here what we're going to do in these 4 examples down below is we're going to evaluate each of these expressions that contain an absolute value. So this first one here says find the absolute value of 5. Remember, absolute value finds distance from 0. So if I think about 5, 5 is 5 units away from 0. So the absolute value of 5 is 5. If I look over at B, B is asking you to find the absolute value of negative 3. So we're trying to find how far away from 0 negative 3 is. And negative 3 is 3 units away from 0. So the absolute value of negative 3 is 3. If we look at C, the absolute value of negative 28. So that's how many units away from 0 negative 28 is, which is 28 units. So the absolute value of negative 28 is 28. And then this last one, the absolute value of 4.5, the same rule applies to decimals as it does to integers. So 4.5 is 4.5 units away from 0. So the absolute value of 4.5 is 4.5. So as we prepare to evaluate expressions that contain the absolute value function, we need to talk about where this applies in the order of operations. So what I want you to notice is that the absolute value actually groups items together. So something like 5 minus 3. This is grouping 5 minus 3 together. And as a result, because this is a grouping mechanism, the absolute value symbol actually falls under the parentheses category. So if you see something trapped inside of absolute values, you treat it like it's a set of parentheses. And we're going to evaluate everything inside of the absolute value and the absolute value itself before moving on to a multiplication, an addition, or an exponent. So here, if we look down at this first example, we see that we have 3, remember smushed together means multiplication. So we have 3 times the absolute value of 6 minus 8 plus 2 times 4. And since absolute value is grouping, that's going to come first in our order of operations. So here, our first step here is we're going to evaluate what's inside of the absolute value. So we have 3 times the absolute value, 6 minus 8, or 6 plus a negative 8 is negative 2, plus then 2 times 4. And now I'm going to evaluate the entire absolute value. So I think the absolute value of negative 2. How far away from 0 is negative 2? Well, it's 2 units away. So the absolute value of negative 2 is a positive 2. And now that I've evaluated the absolute value, I look for exponents, but I don't see any. So I move on to multiplication and division from left to right. I see a multiplication. I then see another multiplication. And 6 plus 8 is going to give me a final result of 14. So the important thing to remember with absolute value symbols is they are a grouping item in mathematics, and as a result, they fall in the order of operations under that parentheses category. So in this slide, we're going to walk through 3 absolute value problems, 3 expressions that contain absolute values, and solve them completely. So here we're going to start, just like we did before, by evaluating what's inside of our absolute value. So we have negative 4 times the absolute value of 5 minus 9, or 5 plus a negative 9 is negative 4, plus 2 to the 4th power, all divided by 4. Then I need to actually evaluate the absolute value, so I see negative 4 times the absolute value of negative 4 is a positive 4, because negative 4 is 4 units away from 0. Then from here, after I've done all of my grouping items, I look for exponents, which I see in 2 to the 4th power. So we're going to evaluate that. We have negative 4 times 4 plus 2 to the 4th power is 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. So 2 times 2 is 4, times 2 is 8, times 2 is 16. So here we have negative 4 times 4 plus 16 divided by 4. Now that we've exhausted all of our exponents, we're going to go through and do multiplication and division from left to right. So negative 4 times 4 is negative 16. We're then going to perform the division and add them together to get a total of negative 12. Okay, if we look down at example 2, noticing very carefully here that I have a set of absolute values and a set of parentheses. So notice that the little curves make these a little bit different. So we're going to now start moving left to right with our grouping items, which the first one I see is the absolute value. So I have negative 2 times the absolute value of 8 plus a negative 5, or 8 minus 5 is just 3. So I then have minus 2 times 5 minus 8. Inside of parentheses, not absolute values. Then from here, I'm going to find the absolute value of 3, which is just 3. It's 3 units away from 0. Then from here in the parentheses, note that these are parentheses and not absolute values. So these evaluate like normal. 5 minus 8, or 5 plus a negative 8 is negative 3. So we have negative 2 times 3 minus 2 times negative 3. Then from here we do multiplication and division from left to right. So I have negative 6 minus 2 times negative 3. Now here's an instance where utilizing keep, change, change might be helpful. So I have negative 6 plus negative 2 times negative 3, which is a positive 6. Negative times a negative is a positive. We add those together and we get 0. All right, last one. We see a variety of absolute values in there, and we're going to start by evaluating those absolute values first. So we start here. We have 3 times the absolute value of 6 minus 10 is negative 4, minus the absolute value of 4 minus 9, which is negative 5, minus 2 times the absolute value of 6 minus 2 is 4. So now we've simplified inside of our absolute values, and now we're going to actually evaluate each absolute value. So the absolute value of negative 4 is 4. The absolute value of negative 5 is 5. The absolute value of 4 is 4. Then from here we look for exponents, but we don't see any, so then we move on to multiplication and division from left to right. So 12 minus 5 minus 2 times 4, excuse me. Next multiplication, so then I have 12 minus 5 minus 8. Then here I'm going to use keep, change, change a couple times. 12 plus a negative 5 is 7. 7 plus a negative 8 is negative 1.